While people are gathering at the microphones, I wanted to ask a quick question, I think mostly of Liz, about positioning here. So these same international visitors often ask, why is it so hard to do health reform in the United States? And I would say that one of the things that makes it uniquely different than tax policy, where it's just taking money out of one wallet and putting it into another, is that to get change, you have to interrupt people's current arrangements. And we all knew that was going to happen, and yet there was never any messaging until it happened. Why?
I agree. I think there could have been a lot better job done explaining the law. But, there was one telling story in the Washington Post in the fall of 2012, and it calculated the money spent by those opposed to the law in explaining why they opposed it, and then the money spent by those who favored the law in trying to explain it. And it was, I think, 4-1. So the people trying to oppose the law were vastly outspending the people trying to explain it. The administration, as I said in my remarks, didn't have a lot of funding to do a lot of ads, and the money they did spend on television advertising is now being investigated by the House Oversight Committee. So what little they tried to do is now they're buried in paperwork with all sorts of requests for emails and spending, and which celebrities you got to come in and how much you paid them. So it's been an uphill battle for the administration. I think they could have done a better job, obviously, but in the face of a lot of other incoming.
Okay. And introduce yourself.
Yes. Jeff Margolis, Chairman, CEO of Well Talk. By the way, I do sit in the same seat every year, and I don't leave in between.
Yeah.
This question, Kavita, you mentioned the turbulent process time of when the bill was passed and some of the politics going on in Washington, which is about when I stopped going back to Washington to visit all of you guys. But can you or Dean or Liz, can you comment on amendability provisions or capabilities in the Affordable Care Act that might make it different or harder for people to get together on this than conventional ways that bills have been passed? And does that have a bearing on the direction we might see this travel towards improvement? Thank you.
Go ahead, or I can.
You mean, so just to clarify, you mean like amendability, things that like there was the Nebraska Cornhusker stuff that actually
And
kind of.
1099 was repealed.
Right.
There was another, the prevention fund's been cut. The Class Act was repealed, although that was administrative.
more
Well, but that
administrative,
was
still-
Congress
right,
actually
right.
repealed the language.
You mean
Is this bill harder to amend
to actually amend?
than,
That's
Well,
what I was.
than
you
is
have to-
typical, and does that create the language of repeal and replace versus fix?
I think it's the other way around,
Yeah,
actually.
I think
it's
it's much
because
easier.
people are so stuck on repeal that they haven't got off that talking point to, let's go in and fix it. I think, as I talk to my Republican colleagues, and Dean probably does as well, they have a list of 20 things they would love to fix if they could only get past the repeal language. There are things that need to be fixed in the law. But if you're stuck on repeal, there's this, we don't want to improve it and we don't want to make it better.
I mean, the IPAB, the device tax, there's actually a lot of areas of, I do think there is an amendability and a desire, and certainly even with the recent reports around the concerning numbers of people who won't pay their premiums, so what's the reaction going to be with Democrats who have been talking about the millions and touting them when it's really not that many millions. So there was even some energy amongst some Democrats and some Republicans around, is there something we need to do to amend so that we can deal with that? And so there's a lot of interest, but I think Dean put it in the right framework where it's really about the execution. We had that nuclear filibuster issue happen over the holidays where Harry Reid basically said, blow up the nominations process to get in like a surgeon general or a deputy secretary or somebody, and now the Senate can kind of blow that up, yet they have been stalled on moving that. So there's an amendability, there's even processes that are pretty volatile in all the decades of what we've seen in the Senate, and yet there is a lack of execution because of some of, I think, the dynamics that you had.
I think about it a little bit differently. I think the things that have been changed that Liz and Kavita both mentioned are things that have been changed to me kind of around the edges. They're not central to the
Right.
core
Yeah.
Medicaid expansion insurance reform stuff that's causing the problems. And the Republicans are coming up with amendments, not wholesale repeal, but they're coming up with amendments and alternatives that are politically designed to underscore the problems. And Democrats, to the extent that some of the vulnerable Democrats are wanting votes on fixing it, it's, I would think, ways to politically distance themselves. So my view is, in the short term, not just because of the language or the partisanship, but I think in the short term, what I think, you might come up with, look, we're having problems in a state like, not California, but like Arizona, that went from 19 or 20 to 1 insurance rating bans to 3 to 1, right? So maybe you could provide the states more flexibility, or maybe you could, look at modifications to the essential health benefits, or those kinds of things I think are going to be very, very hard to do at the national level in a bipartisan basis, at least until next Congress and probably until there's a new president. At the same time, I think, even though I'm a federal-centric guy, that a lot of changes are going to happen at the state level.
So I want to follow on a similar theme, and Dean, you may have answered that it takes 1 or 2 more election cycles, but I'm sort of struck as an observer of all of this, the gap between the magnitude of change that has been put in place and is being put in place, and the, if you will, the shallowness and short-sightedness of the political debates around it that seem to have almost a 7-day horizon, whether it's, extending your policy into March and taking another week or 10 days to pay, the latest fight over the risk stabilization funding. I mean, all of those things are sort of so small in the larger scheme of things. When do we get back to talking about this every other generation big thing that actually is the law?
No idea.
I don't know if we will.
After the next presidential election, perhaps?
No.
But not even then. I'm not sure that we will. I'm a little, I think this was it.
So Dean's placemat slide may be the governing authority here?
Well, I think
13 members overlap?
I don't know if Joe or others would agree with this, but I tend to think that whether Republicans change the rhetoric around it or not, that the fact is that this is the new baseline. I mean, we can't go back to, the employer rules before, which is you can pull stuff out that we've pulled out. You can repeal the device tax, and it's not going to centrally screw up the rest of the law. But to really go out and do this, we're not going to go back to a blank slate and then redo the insurance reforms. You're going to modify the insurance reforms from where they are. We're not going to go back and undo the Medicaid expansion. You're going to modify the terms of the Medicaid expansion to provide the states maybe more flexibility if you're a Republican administration, if we ever see one again, providing waivers. So I think, that to me, whether Republicans acknowledge it or not, I think this becomes the new baseline from which change occurs, and it's just when it happens. You got John.
I'm not seeing anybody up at
John's
the...
in the front row
You
with
got
the
John
hand.
waving.
Okay. John, we're going to give you the last question because I'm sensing low blood sugar levels in the room.
Thank you. I think the core to the plan and the complexity of the ACA is an end of medical underwriting. And as I read the plan offered by the Republicans, the 3 Republicans in the Senate, they did there was still going to be medical underwriting, but it's going to be somewhat constrained, but it will still be. And if you have medical underwriting, then you have to have a mandate. Or you're going to have, Joe, a New Jersey, Vermont, New York situation where you have community rating without a requirement, and only the sick people will be buying. So here's the question. Can you, Joe and Dean, and do you think the Republicans in the Congress, do they want to repeal medical underwriting? Because that, again, is the core of the legislation.
So you can only really say something about the Burr, Coburn, Hatch proposal, I would say. I mean, you have to deal with something that's there. And what they're saying, and it's become, I think, kind of a standard Republican, maybe helpful suggestion, is not to end medical underwriting and not to put it back in the way it was. Nobody wants to do that at all. But to apply medical underwriting for those people who don't maintain continuous coverage. Now, the question is continuous coverage for what? And I think where that proposal would differ vastly from the ACA is that they would give states the right to define what the, if you excuse the expression, the essential health benefits package would be, rather than having it dictated from Washington. And I think their basic idea is to go back to something that looks a little more like, in terms of benefit coverage, the kind of benefit coverage that was common in the individual market. But the idea was not to say, oh, we're going to go back to the bad old days that if you had pre-existing conditions, you couldn't get coverage. It was that whatever your condition was, as long as you maintain coverage, and of course there would be exceptions, and there would be good reasons why that might not be possible for everybody at all times, then you wouldn't, you'd be exempted from this. But for those few people who wouldn't get the message, they'd end up having to pay.
I'll agree with Joe and just answer really quickly. I think the only other thing I would say is I think that they do want to make some modifications so that it may make, in some cases, the current form of the individual mandate not needed. You look at, they've got high-risk pools again, they've got modified community rating. I think the other thing that's going to happen in reality, and I'll preview the presentation on the last panel of the day by my colleague Gina Boscarino, I think your data shows this as well, which is, the Republican idea of the insurance market reform was we're not going to have first dollar coverage, we're going to have higher deductibles, people are going to be more responsible for stuff out of their pocket, it's going to lower premiums. Well, when you look at this stuff on a national average compared to the employment-based insurance market, premiums are actually, again, not everywhere, but on a national basis, premiums are actually lower in a lot of cases on a national basis than they were, but you're finding high cost sharing. And so one query is whether we're sitting here 3 or 4 years from now, the time anyone comes back to repealing, replacing, amending, modifying, and saying, this is kind of what we envisioned. It's got essential health benefits, but in Minnesota, I think the average medical deductible is $4,000. I think across the country, the median is $2,500, and that's only, as you know, going to go up. And so, I'm not sure that Republicans are going to look at the actual coverage 3 or 4 or 5 years from now and say, maybe this does align with their philosophy, aside from the fact that there's these mandates in place. So I'll leave you with that.
I don't know, $4,000 deductible becomes 8 or 9 pretty quickly. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we will end on that. Please join me in thanking the panel.